Okay, in this lecture, we will be talking about different types of tissues, the classification of tissues. We'll talk a little bit about structure and function. So there are four primary types of tissues. They are epithelium, connective tissue, nervous tissue, and muscle tissue. We are going to talk about each of these in detail and the significance of them. They're really important. Now, remember, when a group of cells come together that are similar in structure and function, these cells come together by cell junctions, whether they are desmosomes, hemidesmosomes, tight junctions, gap junctions, and these cells end up creating tissues when they come together. And then a bunch of tissues come together and make up organs, and a bunch of organs come together and make up systems, and a bunch of systems come together and they make the organism. So these tissues, all four of them have distinctive structures, patterns, and function, right? So here, when you look at structures, pattern, and function, again, we're talking about anatomy and physiology, where we're talking about structure and function. And these tissues are going to be organized when they come together to form organs, whether it be the heart or the kidneys or the lungs, etc. When we study tissues, we call this the study of histology. You'll notice that there in anatomy and physiology, there are some histological slides that you look at under a microscope. And that is true with this exam, where you'll see a bunch of pictures that show up and you may have to identify them. Okay. So we're going to start with epithelium. Now, when I think of epithelial tissue or epithelia, what I think of is the type of tissue that is covering the external surface of the body, right? When we think of what we call that external surface of the body, we know it's the skin, but the skin has different layers. The skin has the most superficial layer that we call the epidermis. Then there is a deeper layer called the dermis, and then there is the deepest layer called the subcu or the subcutaneous, aka hypodermis. The epithelium doesn't only cover the external surface of the body, but it also lines body cavities and tubules. Now, the word tubules just looks like the word tube. And inside the body are a bunch of tubes. We just call these tubes different names. For example, we have the respiratory tract. The tract is just a tubular system. We have the digestive tract. That tract is a tubular system where you go from your mouth to the esophagus, to the stomach, to the small and large intestine. This is nothing other than a long tubular system. Inside the kidneys, there's a bunch of tubes. Okay. In the reproductive tract, there is a bunch of tubes. So anywhere we see these tubules, we're going to find epithelium. And it's anything that comes into contact with the external world. So we're taking in food from the external world into our mouth, into our esophagus, into our stomach, right? That's is like a tube within a tube, right? The digestive tract is a tube within a tube. The outer tube is the human body, that shell. So it's a tube in a tube. It doesn't really become part of the human body until we break it down, digest it, and assimilate it and bring it into the tissues of the body. So when you have digestive enzymes from the stomach into that tract, or from the pancreas into the digestive tract, it's releasing those things into epithelium, okay, because that's a tubular system. When we inhale oxygen and blow out carbon dioxide, all of that air and that gas exchange is going through a tubular system. Again, that's made up of epithelium. okay? And glands. Glands are classified as epithelium because they develop from epithelial membranes. So sweat glands and oil glands and wax glands and mammary glands, right? These are all specialized type of epithelium. Now, how do we name epithelium? This is kind of like a big thing, okay? Because epithelium has many different names, and we have to ask ourselves two main questions. Number one, when we look at it under a microscope, how many layers do we see? Do we see one layer or multiple layers? And what is the shape of the cell? So when we see that it's one layer, we call it simple. And if we see that it's multiple layers, we use the word stratified. And we're talking about the layer on top, the apical layer. That top apical layer is what we're looking at, okay? And then we look at the shape of those cells, squamous, cuboidal, or columnar. So when we look at squamous cells, we see that they are these flat, irregular shaped cells. When we look at cuboidal, they look like boxes or cubes. When we look at columnar, they look like tall columns, like buildings, if you would. So simple squamous epithelium is when we just see it's one cell layer thick. Simple cuboidal epithelium, it's one cell layer thick of cube cells. When we see tall columns that are one layer thick, then we call it simple columnar. Same concept, but now we see multiple layers, and we call it stratified squamous epithelium. When we see multiple layers of cubes, then it's stratified cuboidal epithelium. And when we see multiple layers of these tall columns, then it's stratified columnar epithelium. Now there's another type that's called pseudostratified, and this word pseudo means false. So if we look at all of these, we see how the nuclei are at one level, and here you can see the nuclei are at one level, the nuclei here are level, these are all level, and each of these, the nuclei are all level. So it's easy to tell whether it's one layer or multiple layers. But when you look at pseudostratified, it looks like the nuclei are multi-level. So because at first glance we say, well, there's a nucleus here and there's a nucleus up here and another one down here and way up the top, it looks like it's multi-level. So we call it pseudo-stratified because technically it's still just one cell layer thick, but it gives the illusion that it's multi-layered. So we call it pseudo-stratified columnar. And what we see at the apical surface, apical meaning apex or the top, we see these cilia. And cilia typically beat rhythmically. We have these beating cilia within the windpipe, like in the trachea, that beat rhythmically upward, so that if you breathe in any type of dust particles or debris, it sticks to the cilia, and then it pushes them up and outward, so you don't inhale the dust particles into the lungs, but you just do like this, and you cough it up and out. So cilia beat rhythmically. So here's another look at it. We see that we have one cell layer, these flat, irregular shaped cells, simple squamous. These boxes, simple cuboidal. These tall columns, simple columnar. When we see multi-level, more than one layer of these flat, irregular cells towards the apical surface, then it's stratified squamous. When we see multiple layers of the squares, stratified cuboidal. And then once again, here's our pseudo-stratified. It's still one cell layer thick, but because the nuclei are scattered at multi-levels, it gives us this illusion that it's more than one cell layer. So pseudo-stratified columnar. Now there's one last one that I didn't discuss, and it's called transitional. Transitional is when these cells can transition in their size and shape depending on the organ, if it is enlarged or decreased in size, right? If we think of a uterus, it can be the size of a pear if a woman is not pregnant, an inverted pear, or it could be the size of a basketball if a woman is pregnant. so that organ can stretch, which means the cells that make up that epithelium can go through different sizes. The same thing with the urinary bladder, right? Is the urinary bladder full, or did you just go to the bathroom and empty your bladder and now it's small? So if you think of a balloon and you took a marker and you drew, let's say, a letter S on a balloon, or even a circle or a square on a balloon, when it's deflated, it has one type of appearance. But once you blow up the balloon, it distorts, doesn't it? So transitional kind of does a similar thing. And transitional is unique. It's really only found in the urinary bladder, the ureters, the uterus, right? Things that can increase and decrease in size. So still moving along with epithelium, now that we spoke about the structure, let's look at some of the functions. If we saw that you had different shapes, right, different structure, different sizes, different thicknesses, simple versus stratified, there may be certain areas of the body where you need one cell layer thick compared to an area where we have multiple layers. So for example, if we looked at simple squamous, it's only one cell layer thick. So wouldn't you agree that things can passively diffuse through a layer of cells or tissue that is very thin, that's one cell layer thick? So in areas like the lungs where we're breathing and there's this exchange of oxygen and carbon dioxide, we want to make sure that it's only one cell layer thick. But if we look at the skin, let's say the outer surface of the skin and the epidermis, do we want one cell layer thick? Or do we want lots of protection on our skin to prevent us against abrasion or chemical spills, right? So you want to have multiple layers. If you only had one cell layer thick, like simple squamous on your skin, and there was a mosquito on you and you went to scratch it, you'd be bleeding. Your nails would scratch that first layer off and you'd be bleeding. So you need multiple layers of protection there. So hopefully that kind of puts things in a little bit of perspective. So when we look at functions, right, you're going to have epithelium that can protect us from excessive friction or a bacterial invasion or chemical damage. So like the skin, okay? We have cilia that can be associated with epithelium, right? These cilia can beat rhythmically, so we'll see them in the respiratory tract to sweep dust and other foreign particles away from the lungs. Absorption. We have epithelium in the digestive tract. So we have epithelium that helps us absorb nutrients, from nutrients in the stomach or nutrients in the small intestine. Filtration, excretion, and secretion. These kind of go together. When I think of filtration, excretion, and secretion, I'm really thinking of the kidneys, because the kidneys are filtering, they are excreting things, and they can be secreting things as well. So filtration, the kidneys, especially the nephron of the kidney, the nephron is the functional unit of the kidney, and each kidney has about 1 million of these nephrons. They are absorbing, they are secreting, and they are filtering. So we're going to have epithelium there. Excretion, to get rid of. Secretion, glands secrete, like the mammary glands can secrete milk. Oil glands or sebaceous glands can secrete oils. Sweat glands can secrete sweat. And also sensory reception. So there's epithelium that covers the body's surface that contain many, many different sensory organs within it, so that you can tell if someone's lightly tapping you on the shoulder or if someone's poking you, right? Okay. So again, with epithelium, the cilia are these long, slender extensions. You remember from the first week when we covered the cell had cilia that are these long, slender extensions that come off the cell membrane or the plasma membrane, and they beat rhythmically, and they can move the cell, or they can move secretions and fluids across the cell surface. These microvilli are similar to cilia, but they're much, much smaller. They are smaller projections off the plasma membrane, and they're used for absorption. When I think of microvilli, I think of a sponge. The intestines have lots of microvilli that are needed to absorb nutrients. In fact, people who have celiacs or that are sensitive to gluten, it tends to break down and destroy the microvilli. So a lot of these people can get very, very sick due to malnourishment because when they eat the foods, remember, it's not you are what you eat. It's you are what your body can assimilate, meaning that it can digest, break down, and bring into the cells and tissues of your body. It's not you are what you eat. That's what people say, but it's not true. Because think of it this way, you can, like if a baby swallows a marble or swallows a penny, does that copper penny become part of their tissues, or does the baby poop it out in a few hours or later that day, right? So just because you eat it doesn't mean it becomes you. You have to be able to break it down. So microvilli are really, really important for absorption of nutrients. Now, I've seen something like this show up in the past on some of the lab quizzes. So let's take a look at some of these descriptions. It was kind of like a drag and drop concept. So if what type of epithelium can function in diffusion, filtration, secretion, and protection based on location. So that diffusion, that was the first thing I think I showed you with the simple squamous epithelium, where you have that exchange of oxygen and carbon dioxide. Simple cuboidal. When I think of simple cuboidal, I'm thinking of the kidneys, the nephron, the proximal and distal convoluted tubules. Now, this is something you'll learn a little bit more detail in AMP2, but the functional unit of the kidney is called a nephron, and the nephron has certain structures called the Bowman's capsule, the glomerulus, the proximal and distal convoluted tubule. So there's the tubular term again. So whenever you have tubes, you're going to have epithelium. Simple cuboidal is found at the proximal convoluted tubules and the distal convoluted tubules, and the kidneys are involved with absorption, secretion, and protection. Now, stratified squamous, this epithelium functions in the protection of underlying layers. So stratified squamous, I'm thinking of the epidermis, that top layer of the skin, especially that top layer that's called the stratum corneum, the top layer of the skin called the stratum corneum. The pseudostratified columnar epithelium functions in the movement of secretion, like mucus, across the top surface of the tissues. So let's see if I can draw on here for you. Hopefully you can see this. So let's see if I can make this, let's make this black here. So let's say here is the trachea, okay? If you don't see this drawing, you can chime in and let me know. But let's say here is the windpipe, right? It's a pretty crude drawing, but you get the idea. And we're going to have these columnar cells that are going to line it on both sides, right? Like this and like this. And remember, this is going to line the entire thing pretty much like that, all right? And we're going to have these cilia, which are these hair-like extensions that come off of this. And this is going to line the entire thing. Now, let's see if I can change the color here. And we are going to put, let's say here and here and over here, these round cells, we're going to call these goblet cells. Okay, so these goblet cells are going to release mucus. So it's going to release a secretion of mucus that's going to stick here and stick here to the cilia. So that now when you breathe in air and air is coming inward, if there are dust particles or debris, what's going to end up happening is the dust particles are going to stick to the mucus. Any type of debris is going to stick here. And don't forget that the cilia are going to be beating rhythmically in this direction, both of them. So when you get stuff that gets stuck here, you can cough it up and outward. Okay, so that's a little bit about the pseudo-stratified columnar, which we happen to see here in the windpipe or in the trachea. Okay, so goblet cells produce mucus, and what ends up happening, let's say we have a smoker, someone that smokes cigarettes. Unfortunately, what that does is it paralyzes the cilia and it burns them off. So you don't have anything to trap the debris, and what you end up with is tar and chemicals and carcinogens that make it into the deeper part of the lung. And what else happens is that when these cells start to degenerate, your body will want to rebuild another type of cell and tissue, but it adapts to it, but it maladapts. So the body does not regenerate more pseudo-stratified columnar anymore. What it does is it starts to produce squamous cells. It produces squamous cells in the windpipe, but not just one layer, multiple layers. And you'll end up getting squamous cell carcinoma. And carcinoma is a cancer. So you get throat cancer. And when one cell becomes another and you have that metamorphosis, they call that metaplasia. Metaplasia. Typically, metaplasia is precancerous. That's called metaplasia. Meta in Greek, meta, like metamorphosis. Meta means after. So metaplasia is when one cell becomes another type. Women know this better than men because when women go to the gynecologist and you go for a pap smear, right? Pap is named after the Greek physician George Papanicolaou. They're looking for dysplasia. Cervical dysplasia is actually like a precursor to metaplasia. It's when cells are starting to change their shape, right? And they monitor that because they say it's precancerous. Not all cervical dysplasia is necessarily precancerous. We find that many cervical dysplasias can happen in women that are on the OC, the oral contraceptive, due to the drug-induced nutrient depletion. The oral contraceptive tends to deplete the body of B6, B9, and B12. And when you're deficient in B6, 9, and 12, we see cervical dysplasia, especially B9. B9 is folate or folic acid. So when women replenish with the right form of folic acid, many times it's called 5-methyl tetrahydrofolate, 5-methyl tetrahydrofolate, within just a few months, the cervical dysplasia disappears. So that's pretty neat. And then the transitional epithelium, that accommodates distension, like a distended bladder or a relaxed bladder, right? It accommodates the distension and relaxation with changes in that organ volume. So the epithelium, again, to review, we can name it by the number of layers. Does it have one layer? We call it simple. If it has two or more layers, we call it stratified. If it's irregular, flat-shaped cells that are used for protection and secretion, we call it squamous. If they're cube-like shaped cells with a large nucleus that are found in the kidney tubules of the nephron, remember the proximal and distal convoluted tubules for secretion and absorption. We call them cuboidal. And the ones we just saw throughout the respiratory tract, we also find them in the digestive tract. We have these columnar cells. We mentioned the pseudo-stratified epithelium. These are cells that look like they're stratified because the nuclei lie at different levels, but it's a false appearance of being stratified, so we call it pseudo-stratified epithelium. And often with pseudo-stratified epithelium, like I showed you with the trachea illustration, they are pseudo-stratified. Transitional, again, these are associated with organs that can be distended or they can be relaxed. So the urinary bladder, the ureters, the urethra, they're going to have transitional epithelium. And these are just certain places throughout the body that we can see different types of epithelium. So simple squamous epithelium, when it's one cell layer of flat irregular cells, we could find these in the lungs where we're going to have the air exchange. The simple cuboidal, we'll see them in the nephron of the kidney. Again, it's one cell layer of cube-like cells. Here are simple columnar. These columns, they have the nuclei at one level. These are found throughout the intestine. The pseudo-stratified, you can see the nuclei are at multi-levels, but it's column-shaped and it's still one layer thick, so it's pseudo-stratified ciliated columnar. We find these in the respiratory tract. And then stratified squamous epithelium, we have multiple layers of these flat irregular cells. We'll find these where there's going to be irritation, areas of irritation, like the esophagus as food is going down the throat. You know, what happens if you swallow a sharp chip or a cracker that you didn't chew very well? It can scratch the throat, so we have multiple layers of protection. The epidermis, the top layer of the skin, that stratum corneum layer also has stratified squamous epithelium. So with simple epithelium, we could have simple squamous, simple cuboidal, or simple columnar. With the stratified, we can have stratified squamous, stratified cuboidal, and stratified columnar. And the two interesting ones are the pseudo-stratified and the transitional. So that's a pretty good review of the epithelium. When we come back, we'll talk about connective tissue. The other thing I want to point out, when we talk about epithelium, I want you to notice that under the microscope, we see how close these cells are. In each of these, the cells are closely packed together. This is a unique feature of epithelium, because when we get into connective tissue is when we have cells that are very far apart from one another, not closely held together like in all of these. Okay, so let's take a break here. When I come back, we will get into connective tissue.